Thank you very much. Also want to join um, the other speakers in commending Rosa Luxembourg for making this possible. Indeed, this is one area that it's right there on our faces every day. We live with it, we see it, but then there's really not much deep discussion around the issues of domestic workers with respect to their dignity, their well-being, and the challenges that they're having. So in that context, I found this research very interesting, and that generally what the study did was to look at domestic work within the context of course, there are two states specifically in the Northwest that were picked, Katsina State and Kano State. And what the study did generally was to look at the situation of domestic workers in these particular states. And I think that, I must say that broadly speaking, one of the major commendable things that this study has done is to bring out those general nuances around domestic work. You know, the issues around what's the defining domestic work. Sometimes are they defined as domestic workers, domestic servants, or house helps, and the issues around those that are live-in, those that are not live-in. In fact, those concepts around, you know, defining domestic work and how these definitions or these perceptions, you know, also make its way into how they are treated and how they also perceive themselves, and how the whole issue of vulnerability and power relations between the domestic workers and their employers or the households where they work, you know, is connected. So in that context, you know, in that context of general concept and perception, I think the paper, the research did a whole lot of good work, and it also did very well, particularly in the sample area, where the sample, the number of samples, I think it took quite a reasonable good sample that can be acceptable, you know, considering the sample size that is acceptable, considering, you know, the size of the states and the local government as enumerated. I must say, however, that, and then aside from that, the study was also very rich in the area of legal framework, you know, that governs the issues of domestic workers, particularly at the international level. You know, how the ILO, for instance, defines domestic workers, and what are the laws that are expected to protect domestic work at the international level, and also even at the Nigerian level, what it is that Nigeria has adopted. It's really very rich in the context of, you know, outlining the legal framework. So much about that, but I think that one of the issues that I found generally, even in the area of, let's even look at the area of concept, is that whereas the paper, you know, at the beginning focuses on, recognizes that domestic work in the first instance is not just about girls, but that there are women, there are the female, both genders are involved in domestic work, but that it's deliberately focusing on the female gender. However, in terms of outlining, you know, the details, especially disaggregating, you know, the details of the type of questions and how the questions and how the respondents also responded, you know, answered the questions, that gender disaggregation did not clearly come out. So you could see that, okay, questions are being answered by who, you know, and that's the weakness in that insufficient gender disaggregation. You could see its effect in the way the analysis was done later. Also, the inadequacy, even talking about age, what is the age disaggregation of those that are also responding to what question, and of course again, what is the educational, background of those that are also responding to these questions. So the inadequacy or the lack, sometimes of this kind of social and cultural disaggregation you see it wearing its head in the analysis. So for instance, there is an analysis that says that in spite of the fact that their salaries are between 2,000 naira and 10,000 naira, and somewhere, in the paper, in the research, it tells us that this is poor salary. But somewhere, in the data, you come out with a response that says that about a sufficient, a good number, about 25% or thereabout are satisfied, with their work. And I think that is a kind of irony. How are they satisfied when you are living and working in such a very precarious condition, where they have accepted that they are sleeping on the floor, they are being battered, they are being abused. I mean, how do you define satisfaction in that context? And then there are also issues around, so even in terms of social cultural, situation of that geographical area, I think that the study is not quite sufficient. It needs to be deeper, and to also link this with why, would somebody who is obviously, in real terms suffering, accept to say that he or she is satisfied with the situation? Is it because this is, however bad we may see, in practical terms, that this situation is bad, that this person makes a comparison with where he or she is coming from and feels that this is heaven for me as far as I'm concerned compared to where I think these sort of things need to be brought out, and then which is absent, because it's not just enough to say that these responses come this way. We need to understand why the responses are like that, and not just to provide a policy recommendation on the responses the way they came. And then I also saw things that are, there are a few things that are also missing, even apart from the character of the domestic workers, or the nature of the domestic workers, apart from the age and the gender. There is also something around even their marital status. We know that the North, especially these two states, Kano and Katsina states, are places where they experience child marriages. And oftentimes you could find a child between the age of 12, or even a child at the age of 13 has been married twice. You could find a child at the age of 15 has been married 3 times. And by the 4th time the child is coming out of a marriage, the parents are not ready to take you in. So in between, you have to find someone. You don't have a skill, you don't have education. The only thing that is readily available, therefore, is domestic work. So this sort of social cultural, background creates this vulnerability and this acceptance of what is not really standard, acceptable, needs to be brought out. And they didn't see that there. And then there's also this thing around the stakeholders. Again, I saw the character of the stakeholders. The stakeholders seem to be so formal, more formal and less informal, because there are also the informal stakeholders that are involved in the domestic work. And somehow, within the analysis, you see certain things come out that they just prop up, and you don't see the linkage, or you don't see the background, you don't see what explanations to this. For instance, there's this sudden prop up of agents, employment agents, and then are they part of the stakeholders if they are employment agents? There's this group I see around women associations and groups. What women associations and then what groups. It's important that we break this down. And then where is the place of the parents, for instance, who also allow their children to go out? Where is the place of those agents who also give out these children? And then there's also the need for the breakdown around it's very important. In fact, I found something very rich around the way they talk about the salaries. The salaries that don't come often, the salaries that somewhere, even in the particular data table, there's this pay thing about the salary that doesn't come often, salary that is probably never given. It's also important that in terms of analysis and interpretation of that kind of data, to understand what is the cause. It's not just enough to say that, these people are suffering or they are maltreated because they don't even get their salaries. There will be different reasons, not necessarily acceptable reasons, but it is important to also understand some of the reasons behind. Sometimes there are issues about accusing these domestic workers of theft, as could be the possible reason for denying them their salary at a particular time. So how the madam of the house or whoever is involved says that, okay, whatever it is, you are accused, whether correctly or whether with evidence or no evidence, that you have stolen this much, and this much is going to, for this, I'm going to take it out of your salary for the next few months or so. And so we need to understand, what it is. It's not just the action itself, but also what could be the lead, behind such action. So generally, I find a lot of gaps, in the data that comes out, and so that kind of data weakens the kind of analysis that follows, because it leaves a lot of gap. There's the need for a lot of information, to fill certain gaps as to understand why. I also find it interesting that the importance of the education. There's a place where they talk about even the laws. How do you interpret what laws are there around domestic workers to these workers? And then how come, therefore, the data that tells us that the domestic worker, I think about 25% or something like that, are aware of their rights. What rights? How are they aware of their rights? So these things are important. Is it the rights as enshrined in the labor laws or what? And one of the critical stakeholders that I also see missing is the trade unions. I don't see where along the stakeholders there was this, there was any interview about for the trade unions. But incidentally, there seem to be many trade unions represented here. And then when the paper or the study talks about unionization and decent work, and also make references to the ILO, then, you will therefore expect that, one of those critical stakeholders that should also be involved or captured as respondents would be the trade unions, especially the trade unions, particularly perhaps in the informal sector, or organizing in the areas that connects to domestic workers, and that is absent. Then, of course, there's also the thing around the examples. Most of the examples are from foreign land. You find examples of what is happening in Lebanon, examples of what is happening somewhere in the Middle East, and there are many examples in Africa, in Nigeria. When examples come from Nigeria, they are of domestic abuse and maltreatment. You find examples from the Southwest or Southeast, whereas this study is focusing on Northwest. So there's need to look at what are those examples, and there's a huge lot. If there are no documents, published documents, some of the stakeholders identified will have been able to get some of this. For instance, I saw the police, was one of the stakeholders, and the police in their various reports will have a lot of information. The Hisba, the local police, will also have a lot of information, also documented, around what they have seen or what has happened, even in the areas of sexual abuse, violence and all that. So I think that these kinds of gaps, between the general gap is around, linking the information, the data that came out, sufficiently addressing the thematic area of the study. I think there's a gap. And hopefully, just like Prof, when I came and I got the book, I was like, what are we here reviewing? Is it this book or is it another book that we're reviewing? So I think, and generally, I'm sure maybe Onoja will be speaking to this other part of the theoretical framework, which I saw completely missing. Literature review, completely missing. So where are you drawing your references or supporting your reference of analysis from when you have this huge miss, in a critical study like this? It only talks about somewhere around conceptual analysis, and that conceptual analysis is not even broad enough. I think it needs to be deepened, it needs to be widened. And one of the framework, theoretical framework that can be looked at, to explain this kind of situation, because clearly there's a mention of the class aspect and of domestic work in terms of poverty and all that. It's also to look at something within the context of development theoretical frameworks, that could address this kind of situation, especially because of social, disintegration, issues around like estates, issues around deprivations and the yearning for survival. So they are pushed out. They need to find some way to survive. As for particularly those domestic workers that live in, for them is like these other houses or these houses they find, they are really not homes to them. These houses that they find are just like a safe haven for them. So whatever it is that is going on, they just want to feel comfortable there. I didn't see enough of information coming out, even from those people that are also keeping the domestic helps, to find out why some of these issues. Because I think at the point of even the methodology of, using your research methodology technique, it was important that there's a need for a kind of feedback and maybe reconfirmation of certain information. So even if you had used, for instance, under quantitative technique, you had used questionnaire, some of the responses from that questionnaire should probably have informed, even the questions, that guided the key informant interview, or even in addition to that, also some other methods of interview before you just finalize and, close the gap, because this is largely a qualitative research, and then it gives you, the laxity, the freedom to keep going and coming, even through questions, to confirm and reconfirm certain aspects of the responses that have been gotten. So I think I'll just conclude by saying that it's a very good effort, particularly in the fact that as a research study, there's no research study that is complete by itself. No research study is ever complete. No research study is ever final or perfect. A research study always opens a room for further study and for further research. So it is in that context that probably one will expect that some of the reviews we have made here will be pointed out, or can also give room for further research or for opportunity to deepen this study at some other level. Thank you.
Wow. All right, thank you very much, MC and the chair. Absentee chair who has disappeared from vision. I've written down some points and I'll try to run through them very quickly. Otherwise, Awa has mentioned a substantial dosage of those points. I will only interrupt my talking points by recognizing the efforts of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, with particular reference to consistency in being able to publish works, because the point is to put it in writing, because tomorrow we shall not be here. Other people who come in can take off very well. The second point is the effort in bringing students to come and be part of the review audience, because these are the ones who will be country directors, researchers and professors tomorrow, if they take this kind of engagement very seriously, engagements that are outside of the routine classroom lectures. The book I'm reviewing, or the publication co-reviewing with Awa is the one on domestic abuses. I don't know the full title, the longish title. And I was, when I got the electronic version, I was saying, this is something like Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England. Because at the current level of capitalist development in Nigeria, the kind of workers we are talking about, domestic workers, are the equivalent of the early workers in early industrial revolution in UK, in Europe. You know, and with particular reference to the privacy of the workspace. Within the public space, there is the ruling class, or what approximates the ruling class in Nigeria. They don't obey the work ethics in the public place. It's even worse when it becomes the private place. In the household of a big man, the context in which we use the concept of big man in Nigeria, where the wife, sisters are overlords over a helpless worker who has no room, no voice, no capacity to protest, no legal redress, and not even the awareness of even the legal opening for settling cases of disproportionate and indiscriminate use of power. So, to that extent, this is our own equivalent of the conditions of the working class in England. And to that extent, we should all contribute to make it the kind of work it should be. Secondly, this is the kind of work that are academically inviting. Emancipation scholars in critical security studies would be all out for it. And the normative attraction in it means that ideologues fighting against inequality are all out for it. So it's an all-round kind of work that should be something of attraction. And the work starts with a very clear agenda of trying to establish the pattern and dimensions of domestic abuses. It does a good work of it in the sense that it has a geographical region in mind, and it has a set of questions about what exactly goes on in these private spaces. It uses a mixture of data sourcing techniques, one from qualitative interview, qualitative techniques, and the other one from quantitative technique, because they use survey, as I could see there. Now, the connection between power and knowledge implies that this sets in motion. This study is not just an academic thing or a civil society routine, it's also political, because if you have knowledge of exactly what goes on in the domestic space, then it becomes an instrument for political mobilization against it. So automatically, it has an inherent contribution that that is bound to come to note. I see the empirical dimension, the outcome of the study has certain empirical dimensions that are also no less important. One, it gives us details about the typologies of domestic works. I think what was on the previous, all manner of things, the babysitting, the running errands. It's a complete list, and it's in this kind of text that you have that sort of complete list, because most times you have house helps, but they do only one thing that you know. So this work brings them together, all the kind of houseworks that are very good. The average work hours, the engagement in personal skills, the non-monetary benefits derivable from domestic employment, and so on. So that alone justifies this work, because it's a very comprehensive list that we don't have all the time. So we should not hesitate in thanking the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the researchers who have done it. But we are in a world that is contested at every point, left, right, and center. Everything we put on board is contested. And because of the nature of that unceasing contestation, every work that is produced has to undergo critique, not to destroy it, but to see what value that can be added. although as the three previous speakers mentioned, I thought I was confused myself because the book's already printed. So in other words, we might be contributing to the second edition. And when it comes to that, I have a number of points to either emphasize or slightly depart from previous speakers. My first one is the editorial works. It needs to be tightened so that we don't have a situation whereby a particular phrase comes up 3-4 times in one sentence. That is just strictly editorial work. My second comment is the executive summary. In the executive summary, for instance, you don't find the straightforward narrative that should give you an idea of what has been done. Again, that's also a problem of editorial title. What have we studied? Why did we study? And what did we find? It is there. There are elements of it, but it's done in a very loose manner that it doesn't fit the executive summary. So editorial work for the researchers, and it is nothing to be embarrassed about. It's rather something to all, because we all write all manner of things and we give to people to give us second opinion. So it's nothing. My third point is the puzzle was never established. What exactly is the problem was never established. It was never contextualized. It was rather taken for granted that domestic workers are abused. And that became a problem when the research results started coming in, and we'll meet that in front when we get there. And I make the point that the literature review should have been a bit tighter. Literature review is not necessarily a summary of what has been done before. It's a question of finding out what is missing in what has been done. What are the disagreements in the people who have done some works on certain things? Where did they agree, and where does that lead us to in relation to the specific research we are carrying out? So all the gaps, the questions that were left unanswered by the literature is what we carry over to try to answer in what we are doing. If those questions are not there, then there is a problem. So the literature review of this work needs to be tightened too, so that I will take a thematic view rather than standalone summary of what has been done. A thematic review will lead us to the big issues and how our own research will resolve those big issues. Now, the last point is the methodology, and that's where the biggest problem of the work comes in. The first point to note is the research population, the research base is Northwestern Nigeria. Now, there is nowhere in the work where the Northwest was defined or why it was chosen as the basis for the work. Domestic work applies to a certain level of capitalist development. You don't find domestic workers in the kind of environment defined in the work, because in the work, we are told that Northwestern Nigeria is a space of forests where cattle rustlers, bandits, and terrorists hide. Now, that sort of place is an agrarian space. It's not where you find people wealthy enough to employ domestic workers. It's true, Northwestern Nigeria is not a capitalist, it hasn't undergone capitalist transformation. In that case, the innovation that was required is to find a conceptualization that gives ground for the research. And it's easy to say that Northwest Nigeria is an ancient place with aristocrats all over the place, rising middle class, a lot of traders across this Trans-Sahara, and therefore they constitute the kind of family that would need extra hands to do domestic works, because a typical permanent secretary or a top technocrat automatically needs domestic workers, people who mop the floor, who will do laundry, who run errands and so on, who help their wives. So that would have been a good way of covering up, conceptualizing the research ground. That was not done, and it has to be done. Otherwise, why would we have to fight for why do we have plenty of, why is saying there are plenty of this category of worker? Why do we have them in the Northwest, even though it's not a capitalist, not of a capitalist developed place. The selection of the, what did you call it? You said Katsina and I think it's weak.
Yeah.
The reason is this: northwestern Nigeria has 7 states, right? 3 of these states were carved out to produce these 7 states. So naturally, you have an automatic selection base. You could just say Katsina, Kano, and Kaduna. Is that right?
Yeah, they choose Katsina and Kano.
Yeah, they chose Kaduna. So what happens to Sokoto, which is much older, which is the caliphate headquarters, which has more aristocracies than any of the 2, where domestic workers are most likely drivers, household water cooks, and all sorts of things. So I think the selection is weak. There is no way you could exclude Sokoto from that listing. Secondly, why don't we take each of the 3 senatorial districts in these 3 places? That would be much more representative, because if you do that, you have covered, in the case of Kano, if you do Kano, you have done that, you have covered Jigawa, because Jigawa was part of Kano. And at the time, in 1979, for example, selection of 3 people from each of the senatorial districts will cover Jigawa and Kano. The same thing with Zamfara and Kebbi, which were part of Sokoto, and then what leaves Katsina and Kaduna. So if you take, so that I think there is a major weakness there, that the sampling is not representative enough. But the most important deficit of this research is the research technique itself. The argument here is that this research is a completely phenomenological research. That means that the data you need to be able to arrive at any conclusion do not exist anywhere. They are not documented anywhere. They are only in the head of a particular set of potential respondents. That's people who have been house helps. Even if you have a PhD and you are a professor and you have never been a house help person, you will never have that information. So the only way to go about it is to get a technique that goes into the head of those who have been there as house helps. That's the fundamental research, the segment of the population at work. Once you didn't do that, then you are going to run into risks. And we shall see, or as Awa has already started pointing out, the consequences of that deficiency. So that's one major problem that this research has. The research technique selected comes from a positivist tradition, which is questionnaire. So most of the questions, the data came from yes, no kind of questions. And because it came from yes, no kind of questions, then the discursive backup for conclusions were missing. You assumed from the onset, from everything you read before you reach the data, the empirical outcome, was suggesting that domestic workers are highly exploited, they have no voice, they got the worst of conditions. But when you ask them, are you happy with the work? They said yes. How do you explain it? You can only explain it by doing an interview. Because the person will say, yes, I'm happy with it because before I came here, I was almost dying. So that one sentence gives you, to theorize, gives you the basis to theorize happiness with qualification. In the absence of that, we found so many aporias in the work. One is the one that Awa mentioned, they are happy they are doing the work. Secondly, when they ask them, what do you learn on this thing that's non-monetary? They had about 7 items. In the review, I put all the pages, so if you read the pages, I can't see. And when they ask them, do they pay you on time? 11% say no. If you supply 11 from 100, you get a figure about how much? About 89 saying yes, they are paid on time. So the study is demobilized at a point by the data. And the worst thing that happened is that the researchers were not courageous enough to say, we have discovered in our study that domestic workers are not abused. Yeah, because the data they got told them that they are not abused. But because they have chosen the wrong path and had a preconceived notion that they are abused, they had to go on. So the study is running on a parallel. And in the second edition, this has to be corrected. I'm not saying that when you do research and you don't do interview, it is useless. No. Every particular research question has a kind of research technique that is most appropriate for it. Research method is not about formula. It's a political thing. If you want to research underprivileged people, you must choose a technique that talks to them so that they tell you what they feel in their mind. Otherwise, statistical this thing will give you not inadequate information for you to write a research report that will advance their cause. So research methodology is a political issue, and we miss that completely in this work. Everything I have said is by way of critique, and critique does not mean condemning or criticizing. It's clarification to make works, to create room for improvement, and that's the spirit of in case the researchers might misunderstand the reservations we are expressing, is the tradition in academia that if you do your work, you put it on the table, and there is a tribunal that says, yeah, you got it right, or you didn't get it right. And I'm happy that some professors are there at the back. That's what they've done for over that 7 years of it. And if we didn't get it right here, we would love to listen to them, because they are the hierarchy of this business. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you very much. Weeks back, I can't remember which of the publications on intervention, a very cerebral old horse in journalism read a piece I sent written by Adagbonoja on Reader's Digest. I think all of us should try to read it. And what Ogudele Olowu said was that, come, is this a Nigerian? I said, how do you mean? I said, it's not just that he's a Nigerian, but he's from my place of abode, he's from my native community. He said, really? You know, so he was very excited. So I'm not surprised. And for the plea he has made, it should be taken in good faith. For one, when you listen to this number of people who are far younger than myself, you are consoled that there is hope for Nigeria. When I saw my sister Mma walked in here, and the commitment, got time now is getting more precious than before. So for all of us to be gathered here, it means we believe that change can come. And let me join earlier speakers, Professor Joy, big brother there, Professor Lemika, for there's so much they are giving out and the appreciation of the whole process. We also want to be able to, we can't be ungrateful to the process, the institution, the person who lived her life and said, look, I want to leave a legacy, and we are seeing the legacy. RSL. We also want to be able to continue to show gratitude to a young woman in the person of Angela Oda, who is leading a revolution. So this together creates a lot of hope. I wrote a few things here. Part of what I looked at under the condition of house helps and the rest of it is that I'm particular about our obligation as well as responsibilities, how we have failed, and we are not, it has not been captured here yet. So my hope too is that when we do the next volume, we'll be able to capture that. So let me go quickly and run through my review. I'll just speak to the review. So one other thing I captured, I have said that there's the word, talking about the acronyms, WEGO,
WEIGO, I don't know what it is. Then there is also USDS. Then I also mentioned here that talking about the emotional health, which was captured, I think, at emotional abuse at, I think, 86%. One would have expected that the Mental Health Act 2023 would have been captured there. Not only within the acronym, but also be mentioned elaborately within the study, and also bring out the gaps in the health in the national health policy, so that will add up to the very rich review, the very rich exposition that was done by Professor Joy, because it captures a lot of other laws that were not captured in this study. So these two would have been, I think, is the latest law on health in Nigeria. So that would have been helpful, so that we'll be able to look at the mental health, because I know that there was conversation about psychosocial support, but we realize that it is not sufficient to resolve the trauma that these categories of workers have gone through over time. And the unresolved trauma, especially adverse childhood experience, is carried over. It creates a lot of complications for us when we are engaging in insecurity, anger against the state, as well as a problem within the domestic space. And when I look at also different types of abuses too, I said, I can't see a number of statistics from the National Bureau of Statistics captured in this report, that we can make more effort to be able to capture this, because I know there are deaths resulting from abortion, even outright killing within the domestic phase. I also captured that I said, okay, I emphasized that trauma. Thank you, doctor. Doctor had emphasized trauma. The level of trauma suffered by these categories of people, especially given the circumstance, the environmental, the environment which they find themselves, the polygamous house with so many children, so many dependents, and several kinds of visitors coming and going. And given the fact that most of the lots that Adagbo referred to, they are opportunistic achievers who have leveraged state resources, like being around politics, to acquire a lot of money which they can spend at ease. So that too is a major confrontation on the liberty and the dignity of these categories of people that we should pay attention to. There's so much resources that is available. Let me go finally to the recommendations. One of the recommendations I gave, in addition to the many good recommendations I've been giving, is that we must not just talk about talk therapy when it comes to healing of trauma for these categories of people, because they carry bottled up anger that, when unleashed, to be very difficult for any of us to escape. I said we should engage energy psychology therapy, which is not just a talk therapy. And who is to pay for this? The state is to pay, because the state created the opportunity, the gaps that make these categories of people vulnerable. And you see, it's not only this. I know of. I don't know why it was not captured there, because I know of somebody who has worked for a number of. I know of so many house helps that have worked for their lords for as long as 57 years. The duration I saw here, I don't know if it's really realistic. Just like we said again, you have this conspiracy of silence that is difficult to break through. I'm not saying it's impossible. So we can collectively be able to look at what we can do in terms of accountability, because I know that there is a mention of the environment of the domestic aids, and one of their environments is the National Assembly, because we know, as a pillar of democracy, do we have any committee that oversights around this kind of abuses or this kind of intervention. So I think these are the critical opportunities that we all have here, since they are voiceless and their voices are weak. What can we do to strengthen their voices with the information we have, like other speakers have mentioned? So it's, for me, the conversation has come at a time that there is so much going on in the country. There is so much despair. So it has come to elevate the hope of Nigerians. I think we should take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam.